My name's Wally Spence, and I'll be reading Stave 3. Scrooge awoke in his own bedroom, but the walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove. Heaped upon the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, great joints of meat, suckling pigs, long wreaths of sausage, mince pies, plum pudding, barrels of oysters, red hot chestnuts, juicy oranges, immense 12th cakes, and great bowls of punch. In easy state upon this couch, there sat a giant glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and who raised it high to shed its light on Scrooge, as he came peeping around. Come in, come in! I am the ghost of Christmas present. Have never walked with my elder brothers? I don't think I have. Have you many brothers, Spirit? More than 1,800. Spirit, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it. Touch my robe! Scrooge did what he was told and held it fast. The room with its components all vanished instantly, and they stood in the streets upon a snowy Christmas morning. Scrooge and the ghost passed on, invisible, straight to Scrooge's clerks. And on the threshold of the door, the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of the torch. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, and laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose, and known it for their own. And baking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table, and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he blew the fire, until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. What has ever got your precious father then? Said Mrs. Cratchit. And in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. Why, where's our Martha? Said Bob Cratchit. Not coming, said Mrs. Cratchit. Not coming? Said Bob. Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke. So she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the young Cratchit hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. And how did little Tim behave? Asked Mrs. Cratchit. As good as gold, said Bob, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made the lame beggars walk and the blind man see. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire. Master Peter and the 2 ubiquitous youth Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Bob said he didn't believe that there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were of the themes of universal admiration, helped out by applesauce and mashed potatoes. It was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the flesh, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to hear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Hallo, a great deal of esteem! The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like the eating house, and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half and half, a quarter of ignited brandy, and belight with Christmas hollies stuck into the top. Oh, a wondrous pudding, Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. At last the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up, the compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us." "God bless us, everyone," said Tim, the last of all. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," said Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "The odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, and the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful, being done with, the chestnuts and the jug went round and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, and sang it very well indeed. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. And Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, as the scene vanished, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his nephew's own, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side and looking at that same nephew. "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live," cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it, too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew, "who suffers by his ill whims, himself always. Here he takes into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He didn't lose much of a dinner. After tea they had some music, and they set to a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He only answered to their questions yes and no. The fire of questioning elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, rather a disagreeable animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and was not a horse, or a cow, or a cat, or a bear. At last the plump sister cried out, I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is. It's your Uncle Scrooge. Suddenly, as they stood together in the open place, the hell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it no more. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him.